Welcome to the final session of the 2024 TEL Researchers and HE Researcher Series. I'm Puyin Wong, Head of Digital Education from the University of Birmingham and a PhD student at Lancaster University. Before I introduce Professor Chie Adachi to you, I would just like to introduce my co-host, John. Would you like to say a few words?
Good morning or afternoon or wherever you are, evening if you're in Australia. My name's John Brindle. I am Learning Design Manager at Edge Hill University in the northwest of England, and I'm also a PhD student on the Research and TEL programme at Lancaster.
So it is my absolute honour to introduce to you our final guest of the year, Professor Chie Adachi from Queen Mary University of London. So Chie is the Dean for Digital Education in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at Queen Mary. We were colleagues kind of briefly until late August this year when I abandoned ship. Chie heads up the Digital Education Studio, which is a relatively new department in Queen Mary with the ambition to develop and design kind of distant learning courses. If I'm wrong here, Chie can correct me later. So Chie moved to the UK and joined Queen Mary in July 2022 from Melbourne, where she led the digital learning team at Deakin University. And she did bring one or two team members with her, particularly someone called Dr. Joe Elliott. So Joe thinks Chie might be off some Christmas card list this year. Her words, not mine. Chie tends to live life at 1,000,000 miles per hour when she's not disrupting the established ways of doing HICCI. She's running half marathons or climbing mountains, genuinely all over the place, doing all sorts of wonderful and exciting things. But she always found time to connect with people and support people such as today. So we are very grateful for her time. Most importantly, she always finds a way to do HE leadership her way, which in my humble opinion, is the better way. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Chie.
Thank you very much, Pring. What an introduction, and a really kind one and thoughtful one. And I have to thank my colleague Joe Elliott as well, who came from Melbourne, where we worked at Deakin together, to then in now London. So good morning to you all and good evening. I see Ashley joining us from Melbourne too. It's 9 p.m. on a Friday. That's a big party time. Welcome. And it's such a both pleasure and privilege to be able to share my story. And when Puyin asked me to do this, I had to ask, are you sure you really want me to this forum? Puyin is someone that I really admired from afar, looking at how this group come together and really develop this community of researchers in such a global way. And so looking at the lineup of esteemed guests previously too, Phil Dawson is who you had, I think, last month. So it's a hard act to follow. But I am going to do my storytelling today in a way that I hope resonates some stories that you bring to the higher education sector, the TEL work that you do. And you're here, I think, because you're interested in some way to reflect on your practice and your story too. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping to do today. As I sort of started with this picture of an inner child, if you like, looking into the world with a lot of curiosity. And then I thought this kind of encapsulates myself in the way that I look at the world and society and community. And Puyin also mentioned that the kind of running and climbing mountains in my own private life that sort of brings me to do different things that I think exciting. So really for today, I wanted to talk about why I do research and how I've been doing my research. And I never really considered myself as a hardcore researcher as such, but I always considered myself someone who has got a lot of curiosity to look at people, interaction, and society and community. And so I consider myself as more of a practitioner who enjoyed the work of education and then especially working with others to develop and learn and grow. And so that's sort of the foundation that I'll go back to. And so it's really about story sharing, because I think sharing is caring. And I'm hoping, as I say, to prompt you to think and reflect on your stories and think about the future. And I'm hoping to have more conversation today if we can. And so I'll be doing a bit of a talking, but I do not mind you having your own chats in the chat section here while I'm talking. And I'll be posing some questions as I go along. And so if you like to respond to those questions with your own reflection, I would really welcome that. And Puen, as a facilitator, I'm sure can pick up some of the interesting threads and conversations as we go along. So why research? And more importantly, why research matters? I think it's an opportunity that we can look at some phenomena that is of worthy for intellectual pursuit with certain lens that we all bring as researchers, and then a lot of it to do with our identities and then how we have constructed our experiences in learning and growing, I think. And so this is going back my history of where I started. And I also had an inaugural lecture of my own this year in July. And so some of the stories are inspired by some of the stories that I shared at the inaugural. And it was a really good opportunity to reflect and think back where I came from. And that was part of the brief from Puen as well, that for this forum, people wanted to hear how people got to where they got to and why. So that's my grandparents on the right hand side, and that's how you spell my name in Japanese, Chie. My grandmother was called Chie, but with a different character, but she passed away when I was in mother's tummy. And so in Japan, in my culture, people believe in reincarnation, and so they thought that I was a reincarnation of my grandmother, but gave me a different character, Chie. First character is means knowledge, and then the second one is to be blessed. So to be blessed with knowledge, sort of wisdom, no pressure whatsoever to think about my pathway into the future. And on the left, you see myself at 1 year old. In Japan, when you have a first year birthday, we have this tradition of projecting your future career pathway. And then the options that were laid out for me there were abacus, scissors, pen or brush, and money. And you sort of make a prediction as to what might happen to your life. And then the one that I chose, and you can see I made my mother and grandmother really happy, it was a pen, a brush. And so they kind of thought or put me into the way of becoming an artist or scholar or teacher, that sort of career. I don't remember what sort of cohesive behavior that was for me to arrive at this decision, but it was something that was set out to me. And we never really had a lot of money, but there was a lot of appreciation for learning and education, and my parents certainly supported me to learn more in my life and throughout my career. And so I've been always curious about people, as I said, and the practice of what people are doing in different cultures and contexts. And then I always thought that that was the phenomena of the kind that worth exploring and studying. And so in essence, how I enacted on that was around language, especially in the context of society and community, and education, how people learn and grow. And for me, it was a sort of learning by doing in different contexts that I put myself into. As a going abroad, coming from completely monocultural and linguistic family was one of those, putting myself into scary situations and learn from that experience. And you can see my high school self there, that I was completely absorbed with the learning. I don't look so happy, but that was one of the pictures that they chose for the school book that year in the high school. So this is a snapshot at the risk of somehow revealing my age, the timeline of where I've been. And I realize now going to different places was a big part of my learning curve. And so I did all my education in Japan, including my undergrad and master's in education and linguistics. And then during that time, I went to two Western countries, if you like, Australia, Sydney, and Durham for 1 year. And then went back to doing a PhD at Edinburgh. And then I moved to Australia, Darwin and Melbourne. And then I moved back again to London. And so that's sort of in a snapshot, but I wanted to visit those spaces and places that I've been to share then what I've been doing in terms of research and academic career. So that's in the 90s, in a high school that I was, and you can see the mushroom cup was making a big comeback, and that's myself in the circle. And on the top, one of my friends at the time wished me becoming a good English teacher, and that's what I wanted to be. I was aspiring to be an English teacher, sensei in Japan. And then I went on to do my master's and undergraduate in linguistics and English major with I have to say, first teacher that really instilled the love of learning and challenging ideas and a discourse around academia. So that's the Professor Morio Nishikawa. And that was really sort of intellectually charged time for me, and becoming a sort of a person that I once thought possible. So with that, my first introduction to Western culture or academia was in Sydney. This was only a 3-week English intensive course. And so up until in my 20s, I never left Japan. And then I'm not from big cities like Tokyo or Osaka or Kyoto that you might know. I'm from a city called Oita, the southern part of Japan. And so this was a really big culture shock to me. As soon as I landed into Sydney, everything felt big, including the toilets in the airport. And I wanted to go home straight away. I missed home. But somehow I really enjoyed it, from that idea of fish out of the pond experience, that I was learning a lot. And so I had a taste of it, that I went back to Japan, continuing my undergraduate in education, and I decided to take 1 year exchange program in linguistics at Durham University. And this was more of a proper introduction to pedagogical differences that I was identifying between Japan and UK. In Japan, the university and an academia is very much of sensei and the teachers being the knowledge holder. And students are not to really challenge senseis or the other people in discussion. But in Durham, I was starting to be asked to say my own ideas and then challenge those discussion and ideas with other people. And so only 1 year, but it really again changed my perception of what was really the Western academia and academic pursuit in the Western discourse. So then finishing my master's, I prepared myself to secure the funding from Ministry of Education Japan to then do my PhD at Edinburgh. And as I say, because my family really didn't have money, without this, I wouldn't have been able to continue to do my PhD, but I was very fortunate to secure this. And Edinburgh was such an intellectually engaged space. The Enlightenment happened, the history, and then the social linguistics department that I was in, with some of the amazing, brilliant minds of the field. And Miriam and Mitz were my supervisors, but they were really part of the community, if you like, in doing the sort of academic and intellectual pursuit that people can see. And so I was starting to really integrate what it means to be a scholar in a Western academia. So that's my PhD, and I really hope that people, if you haven't completed your PhD too, that you bind the PhD. That was sort of one of the moments in which I sort of felt the accomplishment, even though the submission of that book or digital copy was really anticlimactic. that kind of felt something, and then I still have it, and that's in my flat in London. And I also published a few work outside of that, and this was looking at compliments as a speech act. And at the time, since the 80s, a lot of the work was written on the speech act of compliments and responses in Western academia, but there's not a lot written about Japanese compliments. And so this was going to be my contribution to the field of knowledge on speech act and compliments. And so if you ask me my sort of weapon or go-to, the research methods and underpinning of where my research comes from is really around linguistics and social linguistics in particular. And then I just wanted to mention a few of the subfields of linguistics that still allow me to do the research that I do in education, digital education, and higher education. So linguistic anthropology, that Durante's textbook really taught me about ethnographic technique and the sense, the sociology, government idea of face, and then how that constitutes in a society and in the community. That still today is a really helpful research technique that I learned and then still use in my research. And discourse analysis, the Brown and Young is a textbook that some people might know that I used to teach as well. And then pragmatics, within which I drew a lot on politeness and speech act theories in looking at the compliments as a speech act, but that has a lot of implication for language use in society and in context. And so I drew a lot from Brown and Levinson and Austin in particular to do this work in the analysis of Japanese compliments that I created as a corpus. And then the last one is language and change, so variationist social linguistics, which is essentially what Miriam was really known for. And William Labov, probably some people know this name too, looking at different change of language that happens in a community. And sometimes language is not just about grammatical or phonetic or other constraints, but socially constructed. And then how language gets enacted and does things in society, it requires different set of lens to look at this phenomenon. So at the heart of all of this, as I say, I keep coming back to understanding the phenomena of people, language, culture, and interaction, and how all of these things intersect and manifest in the now realm of education. So pedagogically speaking, these are the people that have been always inspired, and I see some nods from John here as well, and pointing that Paulo Freire and bell hooks, the critical pedagogues in the field, and the idea that education liberates people, that makes freedom and develop others to become who they need to become. The idea of literacy that Paulo Freire talks about, the one that navigates the world in a broader sense. I've been always quite inspired by that, and that's sort of educationally where I bring myself to do the sort of research that I do now. So having done that PhD in Edinburgh, then I moved to 10,000 miles across the pond to go to Australia, but not major cities, but Darwin. I don't know if many people know about Darwin or where it is. It's in the top end of Australia, and it's a really small population of 130,000 or so, and it's the highest population of Indigenous people that live in Northern Territory. And it was, I have to say, once in a lifetime experience, and I was there for 3 years, and it really changed my life. But initially, it was a lot of adjustment, because it was sort of not just a cultural change, but also climate change. It was dark and cold in Edinburgh for 4 years, and then hot all the time all year in Darwin. It was actually 30 plus degree all year round, and they have 2 seasons, dry or wet. And so it was a completely different culture. And this was the first time to understand, also having had that Sydney experience a few years back, that Australia is not just a white society, actually not at all. And it was a great exposure to learn from Indigenous ways of working and learning and education. So I landed on this job as a linguist to work at the Charles Darwin University and Bachelor Institute of Indigenous Education. And at the time, they had this centre called Australian Centre for Indigenous Knowledges and Education, ASICI. And then they had this philosophy of education that's called both ways. And so it's the idea of Aboriginal and Indigenous knowledges interacting and evolving with European knowledges. And so it's not one or the other, but it's the emergence and cultural integration of those cultures to then become an educational philosophy. And so I was really inspired by that, and I learned a lot from the people that I worked with in this Northern Territory. So to say a bit more about the kind of work that I was doing there, during that time in Darwin, I also had an opportunity to work with one of the Indigenous cultures in Central Australia. So Chinchaputa, Santa Teresa community, just outside of Alice Springs. I say just, but it was actually 80k out of Alice Springs. And so I'm driving a trooper, a big wagon going back and forth with Alice Springs and Chinchaputa, but also flying in from Darwin to that community for about a year and a half. I did that sort of working with Veronica Dobson in particular, who is an elder, really respected linguist and ecologist from this community, to then create 3 online undergraduate modules on Central and Eastern Alanda language and culture. And it was interesting and it was challenging in terms of both how I was perceived as a Japanese linguist to then go into this community and work with such a small community of 700 people. And I was also new to the country, Australia and Darwin and Northern Territory. And so I was really fortunate to have an amazing mentor and elder like Veronica, and thinking about the work that we were doing then is really something to remember now that I'm looking back. As I say, I was working as a linguist, but also starting to work a lot more for online because at the time this university, Charles Darwin University, was doing a transition to implement the new LMS Blackboard. And so this project that I was working on in the linguistics department was largely part of that, to then transition and create online modules. And so then I was realizing the Indigenous ways of learning and teaching has a lot of resonance with digital, because a lot of it is traditionally oral oriented. And so people were teaching their younger generation through storytelling, a lot of talking around the circles. And so we were doing a lot of interesting media creation based on the key concepts and the type of understanding that they needed to bring for their education. So that picture is one example of my hands and Veronica's hands firmly embedded on the country, and the country and the land provided a lot for their learning and how they interacted with each other. And so meaning of a place is something that I never really grasped before, but here I was starting to learn a lot more how place dictated the way in which people learned and connected. And so this was a chapter on kin and skin. You can see the traditional diagram that people teach others how they connect with each other, but we're trying to make a different types of representation with digital media, and a lot of the video work that we did was also part of this. Just to mention a couple of key people that really helped me grow in that, and then supported me in that community is Sue and Hank. And so Sue is a Kongarkan indigenous woman herself, and she was my boss at the time, and a historian. And Hank is also a social scientist and educationalist. And some of you probably know him, who is doing a lot of work with Ascalite at the moment. And so thinking about the self-determination theory that penetrates through the idea of neoliberalism and surrounding the indigenous knowledge and education, we're starting to do the work around this kind of idea. And then again, it was a sort of transition from me to go from the linguistics work to education and online education a lot more. And then I'm moving to Melbourne. So 3 years in Darwin and Alice Springs, Chinchaputa, moving to Melbourne, a lot more digital work to happen. And so I was briefly at Victoria University first, and then Deakin University for 7 years, where I held 3 posts. And so it's a really quick transition from lecturer to senior lecturer to associate professor, director digital learning then. And again, this was a really vibrant community and just an amazing opportunity to work with exceptional leaders in digital and in higher education research. And so some of the faces that you can see there, I was in the central learning and teaching portfolio then. And so this was again a sort of transition moment in my career to go from the linguistics department that I was in top end of Australia, then to move to central learning and teaching portfolio to work with more of a digital education experts. And then I met CRADLE, so Center for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning, led by Professor David Bowell, that some of you again probably know, and his crew or exceptional researchers. And I started to do more research with them. And I was also working a lot with EdTech, and by EdTech I mean broad things here, that not just entities like FutureLearn as a partner, but also actual tech, like Feedback Fruit, for example, that is a self and peer assessment tool to then implement for the whole of university. And so I was going through a lot of transition, both professionally and personally, to go into the work of learning and teaching. And I might just pinpoint that Jo Elliott here on the right hand side, and so you can see that she was also one of the Deakin Society there. So this was when I was starting to think more about the importance of practice and scholarship. And I assume that all of you are in this space as well, that you're doing the work of teaching or the work of technology enhanced learning, digital education, and thinking about how might we do scholarship or educational research around that. And in circles, you see the kind of projects that I was working on. So like I say, the digital tech, EdTech tools project, such as the self and peer assessment, to more of an educational teaching work that I was doing for the Masters and Grad Certs of Digital Learning Leadership, of which the MOOC that I did with Deakin in Transforming Digital Learning was part of. And so the range of things that I was starting to do. And people at Deakin taught me essentially 2 key things. They started to talk about this idea of research, what you're doing. And some people might resonate this with the umbrella term of action research. But really, it meant 2 things. One is about taking the evidence approach or the critical approach to our practice and enhancement of our practice, and in the end, students' experience and teachers' teaching practice. But also, the other thing that I learned through hard way is that we need to be strategic because we don't have a lot of time in our day-to-day work that we do. And so we need to be really targeted in the effort of doing research work. And so that's sort of the underpinning work and thinking that was starting to bubble up. And I was also doing outside of Deakin work with Ascalai and co-founding the TEL Advisors. Some of you might know this group as well, now really being successfully led by Colin and others, and it's wonderful to see that third space professionals conversation is continuing to happen. And then I moved again 10,000 miles after having done Australia, and it was actually a big decision to have to make. You know, when you're in a place for 10 plus years, 11 years I was in Australia, you get comfortable and you kind of know people, and you know a lot of the practice that happens in the area that you're working with. And so to then leave everything and then go into a new place and then start from almost scratch. I knew some people in the UK, and then I can see some of the colleagues here too that I've come across, but to go again to a different direction and then start something from scratch has been a big shift. And this was really about the leadership work that I wanted to do. And so I went from an associate professor that I was at Deakin to professor and dean role, which I can talk about a bit more later. And I'll stop after this slide point. So if you want to pick up some of the conversations in the chat, we can. I wanted to also share my struggles and then the challenges that I had and then I continue to have, because some researchers who have a lot of work published and seem very established, I think would also have some of the struggles. And it's sometimes good to hear those kind of thinking, and then people learn from those stories too. And three key things that I've struggled the most and then continue to work on. Time. We live in a liberal universities and society that we never have enough time to do a lot of things that we would like to do. And in some areas we hear things like less, more with less, and we need to be productive and so forth. So I do struggle to make time for the kind of things that I really do want to do. And then the kind of thing that I want to do usually takes a good amount of time to be conceptually thinking about something, staying with the ideas, coming up with the approaches to be then able to do the work that you want to do. And then that also ties in with the idea of resources. And it's not just the kind of materials, but I'm also thinking the types of research questions that you might come to think worthy of doing. And then you realize that the methods or the types of approaches that you can take are limited, that it might not be so conducive to be doing this research by yourself. And so then you can think about involving others and so forth. But it's not always straightforward, I don't think, given the kind of phenomena that you want to research, and then to think about the practical way in which you can then apply and collect data, and different types of data are available, and some of them takes much longer and much more intensive ways to collect this kind of data to then analyze. And then the last one is around confidence. It's really about believing that your ideas, questions and research are worthy of intellectual pursuit. I think we sometimes doubt ourselves in thinking that this is worthy, and therefore question of time and resources comes up and up again. And then also this was for me a challenge to then reach out to decide who I can collaborate with. I can talk about it a bit more later, but people like Phil Dawson and Cradle members that I worked with, I always felt as though I'm asking a lot to be able to work with people who are really busy and doing amazing research. And so I was a bit skeptical of if they would be willing or interested to work with people like myself. And so I might just stop here, pause here, point, and I haven't gone through the chats yet, but is there anything that people would like to chat about for now?
Yeah, we have a question about, how how did you find your voice in as a I completely resonate with the question as a Southeast Asia person. How did you find your voice when you first arrived into the West and country sort of classroom? Because we don't really speak in classrooms. I
Mm.
understand where you're coming from, and so yeah, how did you find your voice in the West? How did you become, do as you're told, be seen, not be heard, to now having the confidence to, speak publicly and have opinions? W- Where did that transition happen?
Really good question. And I must say, it's not being an easy, straightforward path. As you say, Pyoen, I think cultural underpinning is so strong, especially if you lived in that particular culture for such a long time. To then change is feels out of sorts and an almost identity crisis that we must go through. And that's kind of how it felt for me. And in the end, it's just practice. In the end, it takes time. In the end, it's just keep coming back to asking, who is it that you are, with the view of changing and evolving as an individual is just the natural path of being human. And so finding a voice is part of the journey. And I still struggle with this, and then I'll talk about it a bit more later, but it's just something to keep in mind, that our cultural underpinning is somewhat different, but every culture has its own, and it's okay to challenge, especially having learned how that particular society works and learning from those experiences. It's a practice to keep coming back to, I think.
I agree, and I think the kind of not having the permission to speak, or not being allowed to express your opinion, for me anyway, yours might be different or similar. It's those kind of like not allowing you to do this and that is self-imposed.
Mm.
It's not like your Western teacher is always going to encourage you to speak. Your supervisor in a Western university is always going to encourage you to speak. But for me, it's almost like, in my head, psychologically, I always think if I speak, I'm going to get into trouble. I don't know if you agree with that. I found that just it's all in my head a lot of the
Yeah,
time.
it's the fear that we have, isn't it? That we don't quite understand how the cultural norm is framed in that particular context, and there's a lot of uncertainty around how you might bring yourself and raise your voice, not in a raising your voice and then speaking loudly, but in a way that you reveal yourself. And we make mistakes, and I think even in the Japanese culture, I always felt a little bit out of sort, that I was an outlier in the way that I thought about things. And that's difficult too. And so you can feel dissonant within even your own culture. And so I think, again, it's just a practice of raising and paying attention to your own voice and becoming who you are through the journey that we're all on.
Hi, Chia. It's nice to see you again after such a long time. I hope that you're hearing me.
Yes, we can.
So your story is very inspiring to me because, you have immigrated from country, and you also changed from an ethnographic researcher background to a more digital education space. And this is a migration by itself, on top of the migration from country to country and from state to state, even in Australia. So how do you see how did you manage to settle your professional identity in digital education space finally, after coming from that ethnographic research sociolinguistic background? Because I myself I'm also based in ethnographic research and sociology, and I'm finding myself a bit out of space sometimes. So I would like to hear your story about your professional identity evolving from ethnographic research, sociolinguistic to the digital education space?
No, it's such a great question, Asli. Thank you. And this is a journey, right? I have gone through a lot of identity crisis every time I changed something, whether it be the academic background or the places, and there's always the shock of coming out and going into the new water. And every time I'm comforted by the idea that I'm learning and evolving, and that itself is worthy of sharing. And I have always had this idea that I'm not going to say no to certain things that are just offered as learning opportunity. And so I need to rethink about this in light of what I said about time and resources. I need to start saying no to certain things too. But I always wanted to embrace those opportunities that were given to me because of the journey that I was putting myself into. But it's scary and it's difficult at times to build the credibility that you need to bring to the work. But it takes time, once again, to learn and work with others. And then I have to say, I've shown some of the really bright minds and mentors that really developed me. I learned a lot from those people, especially Deakin was just a big change moment in my life. 7 years working with the best academics and educational leaders in the field, and then to keep applying myself. And so I wouldn't say, probably this is why I don't say I'm a hardcore researcher in one field, but I've evolved a lot to apply myself and take those opportunities for learning and growth. And in this sector, you know, if you're role modeling the kind of work that you want to develop for others, you need to be putting yourself into the learning opportunities and growing yourself. But it's not an easy path. I have had many identity crises in my time so far, and then more to come, I'm sure.
What are some of the transferable skills that you brought from your ethnographic research background to leadership and also digital education space?
Yeah, good question. A couple of things I would say. The adaptability is one of them. And so path and interdisciplinary work is quite messy. And quite dynamic in involving a lot of people. And so ethnographic study gives you the lens to look at people and phenomena in a community to then identify how patterns emerge. And so adaptability for ones to be able to apply and change as they go along is sort of really important. And then the other one, the transferable skill set, is the idea of innovation and change, that it keeps evolving as you go along. And it's slightly different from adaptability that I'm talking about, but that you want to have the flexibility to be able to innovate and change in the way that you do your work. And that comes with a certain skill set, I think, to be able to do that. And so I would just say that for now. So then I wanted to share some of the stories behind the publication that I had. And so it's not just about the work itself, but it's sometimes about how these papers and scholarly work come about. And one of the things that I really would like you to reflect on is around this idea of impact. And I just grabbed my Google Scholar, which is one of the metrics, isn't it, that people use to think about and talk about impact. And I don't say this is good or bad or anything, it's just in one example. And thinking about impact, this is really useful, I think. As I said, I started to do more of a project-driven work, a scholarly work, in the way of what I was doing in practice was worthy of intellectual pursuit. And the first one I worked with the Cradle members was the self and peer assessment. And so this was about also learning to get into the new area assessment. This was ASLI. And I haven't really done a lot of assessment research before then. And so this was a good opportunity because I was already working on the innovation project for the university. And thinking about the after effect of impacts, if I go back to the Google Scholar, this academics' perception of benefits and challenges in self and peer assessment, that's got quite a lot of citation as opposed to the framework for designing researching and peer assessment, because we thought that the framework would be more popular or something that people refer to, but actually a lot more citation came from the perceptions of academics. So in a way, understanding what other people's stories were like in assessment, peer assessment. So that was a bit of a surprise in thinking about the impacts afterwards. And also the timing, because going back to what I said about time as a constraint, what sort of timing do we want to do this particular research? I think that's another aspect that you would like to think about. And pandemic in particular, in light of what digital education is really evolving for, this was one moment in time to think about for me. And so this paper, Transformation or Evolution, Education 4.0 in the Digital Age, was a case in point with Chris and Marie from University of Bath, who were visiting Deakin, and our colleagues Alan and Matthew in Australia. We decided to do this case study paper, but it came out just as the pandemic was happening, and with the catchy title, people started to cite and refer to this kind of work. And so that was, again, after effect of thinking about timing of publication, but it was really interesting to see. Another one during the pandemic that I did was this manifesto for teaching online. Some of you probably know this book by Bain and the Edinburgh University folks. I really feel inspired by that book, and then I was held close to my research and underpinning of thinking about education in digital sense. But I wanted to be part of the response to this work, and it was a call sent out to colleagues across the world to do this work during that pandemic. And it was only 500 words that everyone was invited to write, but I brought my linguistic and culture studies background to then write this piece to disrupt the Western discourse of how you think about digital education. And it was really short time that needed, but meaningful work for me at the time during the pandemic period. So the next one is about collaborators. Who do you collaborate with? And as I say, it took me quite a lot of confidence to then approach different people. And sometimes you get invited to work with different people. But I think this is an important aspect to think about when you're thinking about doing research. This is a really hot off the press paper that we just published with Margaret, Joe and Michael from Monash and Deakin. But this is looking at the case study of the project again that we were doing in Melbourne before I left, EdTech Alliance Innovation Project, which was funded by the Victorian government at the time, and in bringing the EdTech companies and players working with university researchers in the field to do this work. And we started to think about what enables and hinders collaborative and contentious spaces. So I'm kind of being a meta here now to talk about collaboration in a research sense with other scholars, but also the work that we looked at was the collaboration and that was happening across these three types of stakeholders. And so thinking about who you want to collaborate and who you want to write the work really makes a difference, because you learn so much in that process. So this is the another paper this year that we published with Professor Louise Uni. And for me, this was my entry into medical education. And so going back to your question, Asli, another new dimension to the professionalization that happened in my work is the medical education, because now I sit within the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. And she had this 20 years plus of practice in doing a creative art for medical curriculum. And then that was a really good way in for me to then work with Louise in looking at what nurtures medical education online. And we analyzed the case study of what she was doing during the pandemic transition to do this kind of flourishing and human dimension work in medical education online. So that gave me another opportunity to learn new dimension to add to my work. And then the last one is the educational leadership work. And this is something that I did as a project, or also the consultation exercise that I did within the faculty when I first arrived, to launch a large listening exercise, essentially, in understanding what people's practices were, and then how digital education was occurring within this faculty. And so I spoke to nearly 400 staff and students in identifying opportunities and challenges that people were telling me, so that I could write a strategy for this faculty and the university. And then after, I managed to publish this as a scholarly work. And so it's combining the leadership work with the practice that I wanted to bring, but in a strategic way. So if I can talk a minute about leadership work, I already sort of touched on this, but it's probably the strongest identity now that I hold within the academia, a lot more than teaching that I used to do once. And so context and identities really matter and evolve in thinking about one's leadership work. And for me, the context in which I came into London was, it's a Russell Group University. Deakin was not, group of 8, and from Australia to UK. And then also, again, I moved from the central learning and teaching portfolio to a faculty. And then I'm the first and only dean of digital education that's existing in this faculty. So the other 2 faculties of this university don't have the equivalent, if you like. And then I'm a social scientist sitting in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. I don't have a medical background. And so in many ways, I'm sort of an outlier. And then identity sphere, and I'm saying that identities in a very intentional way, that it's multi-layered. And again, it's sort of a framing of the minority. I'm a female and I'm a youngish. I'm not that young. I'm just a Japanese and I look young, but I'm not that young. And then I'm a BAME background and NESB. I don't like those acronyms that kind of reduce people into letters, but I am categorized as those, and low socioeconomic background. And so I think we all felt that yellow bottle in the picture, and that's out of sorts, going into a big pond of water that you don't really know a lot about. And so thinking about how we might bring our identities and practice to the research, to the practice that we do, is really critical. And I'm becoming a lot more aware now to do this kind of thinking and work. Just last quick word point, I know I'm paying attention to the time. Third space professionals. This is interdisciplinary, and we are all boundary crossers, and we can speak in different languages, and that code switching is critical for us to be able to navigate and perform the work that we need to do in this evolving, ever-evolving field of digital education. And so to answer your Asli question, it's sort of here in thinking about the third professionals' capabilities. There's a lot to answer from this area and the thinking. So I asked a lot of questions, and this is the summary slide, if you like, Puen, for people to reflect on. And I sort of answered in my own way with the stories that I shared.
It's just been really interesting and inspiring to hear your journey, and like you were saying, a lot of people, I think everyone struggles, but not everyone is sort of brave enough to admit it openly. So that's just really inspiring. And I think the lesson to learn is that we're all humans, we all make mistakes, like you said, we all progress somehow through making mistakes and struggling and asking for help. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's my kind of biggest takeaway. If you don't ask, you don't get. If you ask, wonderful things might happen. I asked Chia thinking, oh my God, she's busy. She's going to say no. She was like, of course I'll, and that's what is here today. So thank you very much, Chia, for your wonderful conversation with us.
It's been my pleasure, and I see lots of comments coming in. Thank you. And then I noticed some of the people that I worked with as well, Simon, Werner, and some of the names that I don't know yet either. But if you like to connect with me, I have my slide with the contact, and so I'll share that with Puen, or I'll put it in the chat as a link, and you can always approach me. But thank you for having me.